So the Phaedo, which that obviously was not a honest sketch about what really happened, but in the Phaedo, notice Plato's not even in the dialogue, but this is in the scene, in the cell, where Socrates is given the hemlock, and they're arguing about how anxious he must feel knowing that he's going to die. And he's actually pretty okay with it. And his argument is that the most important part of him, his soul, has no parts. His soul has no parts. And so the soul cannot be destroyed. As far as he understands the soul is not the body. The body can be destroyed, and the hemlock is going to kill his body. But his soul doesn't have any parts. And if you think about it, when you put something together, you're putting the parts together and you make it work. And when you destroy something, you take the parts apart and it no longer functions, right? So the soul, if it doesn't have any parts, is not something that you can make, nor can you destroy it. And he clearly argues that the soul has no parts. It was neither destroyed or it was neither created nor can it be destroyed. And we actually tie this in to perhaps other traditions, maybe Zoroastrianism or maybe Buddhism. This is all, in a sense, happening in what's called the axial age. You ever heard of that? The axial age? Let me pull that up. And what they mean by the axial age, roughly, is that right about the same time, in 3 different places, the Buddha, Master Kung or Confucius in China, and Socrates and Plato and others in Greece, are all going to revolt against the traditional priesthood. So the Buddha, for example, tries out all the different Hindu religions and then sits under the Bodhi tree and becomes enlightened and realizes that all of those religions are wrong. And instead he starts Buddhism, right? Socrates is not quite so blasphemous, I would argue, but he's going to basically also put the priests in that quandary where if the priests say, God has told me, these are the 10 commandments, that everybody has to follow, you could use your reason to argue with the priest and say, well, how do you know that that's the voice of God, right? How do you know that God was telling you that, right? In fact, when we think about the development of the human mind and how it's bicameral, 2 sides, right? 2 rooms, like, right? The interesting book by Julian James, and the bicameral. It's a very interesting book. This is from, I think it's even earlier than August 2000, but, because I think that's the paperback maybe, argues that as the human mind started to develop and has 2 different sides, that we literally could hear ourselves think. And initially, the people that first did that couldn't figure out who was talking to them. Because you're hearing yourself think. You're thinking to yourself. And as you're thinking to yourself, how do you know that you are the one thinking to yourself? that you're having an internal dialogue. Well, today you grow up with people telling you that that's what's happening. Didn't you think to yourself before you kicked the dog? Says your mother, right? I should not kick the dog, or the dog will eat my foot, which happened or something, right? You have to think for yourself. You're thinking for yourself. As an American, you grow up not only thinking for yourself, but as Peter Berger argues in his one book, the heretical imperative. Heretical. It's heresy, right? To think that you can decide for yourself what you want to believe, right? It's heresy, literally, right? And yet, if you join the army, as at least years ago, they give you a form to fill out. One of the things you're asked is, what's your religion? What religion do you believe in, right? And you've got the choice, to pick Rastafarian, Pastafarian, Buddhist, Taoist, Christian, Mongol. No, wait, that's not a religion. But you get the idea, right? You get to think for yourself and choose for yourself. That's literally what heresy is, thinking that you can choose for yourself. So Peter Berger points out, as an American, you're actually a heretic. You have no choice to be a heretic, because the government says you have a choice to decide for yourself what you should believe in. If you go to Saudi Arabia, you don't get that choice, right? You have to believe in what the government supports. It's a theocracy, right? So you literally have to believe the state religion. Or, you can, of course, suffer the consequences, right? But with the origin of consciousness, Julian Jaynes, I don't know if you would accept his argument, but he's basically talking about how we hear ourselves thinking over our various questions. And he argues that the original beginnings of this, people didn't know that they were doing it, that they were the ones responsible for their own thoughts. And especially if they were psychotic, like if you've ever met anyone that's psychotic, in the room while a psychotic person was yelling and screaming just the other day. Not sure if he was yelling at me or someone else that wasn't visible to me, right? Using impolite words, actually, right? It's kind of unnerving, but how do you react in that situation? Because clearly he saw someone and he was mad at that person. I have no idea who that person was, right? Is that what happened when the first people started saying, God said to me? Were they psychotic? Hearing voices? And today, if somebody says, I went up on the mountain and God said to me to do such and such, we would try to get help for that person, right? We would maybe send them the API if they had the space, right? Maybe find medication to help them so that they wouldn't be under the illusion that they're having conversations with angels and things of that sort, right? So it's a medical issue for us today. But obviously there's some famous people that came up with God speaking to them and people listened, right? So that's pretty interesting, I suppose.
Does that kind of come back to like the whole perception is reality? Like, I mean, anybody can say they hear anything, honestly, but because to them they maybe did, but doesn't mean anybody else does. So back to the question from last week.
Yeah, well, from what I understand, it's a very complex issue. When they do brain scans of individuals that are having an experience, they're clearly having an experience of something. Now, their eyes might not be reacting to someone visibly, so that, of course, seems to indicate a good reason why we might not agree that there's Abraham Lincoln standing there talking to you. We don't see Abraham Lincoln, But when you're absolutely convinced that you're talking with Abraham Lincoln, who am I to say you're not seeing it, right? And the brain seems to reflect that, right? Then we have issues, of course, over, well, why are you experiencing that? And my favorite understanding of how this might be explained is that our microtubules, which are in our neurons, and they're quantum particles. The microtubules are covered with a sheath, a myelin sheath, and the thickness of the myelin sheath is genetically dependent, so that not everybody has the same kind of cabling as everyone else, right? And if you think of it, a myelin sheath is just like the rubber on a TV cable, and if you don't have that solid and a good cable, you could have bleed over so that you lose signal or get interference and so on. In a sense, some people have more of a interference from non-local events, right? Things that are not immediately around us, but are actually still going to influence our quarks in our microtubules, right? So if you think of it that way, some people are more open to interference than others. And that's not necessarily bad. A lot of cultures think very highly of the people that can see these things, and usually treat them as sacred individuals or special individuals. If you're interested, though, there's like a whole history of madness that Foucault wrote, which is really fascinating. Talks about how this is treated all throughout history, and dependent really on how the society thinks about what's going on in the head. Is it evil spirits? Is it the person just not working hard enough? Is it mental illness and so on?
PTSD, like that kind of stuff too.
Right.
What era was Foucault?
Foucault would have still been alive had he not died so young, I think. He died of AIDS.
This is up to date, the history.
Um,
It's fairly up to date.
God bless you. So this is a relatively new translation. So the reason it's out just in 2006 is not because he's still around. It was published, as it says, originally in 1961. Would he have still been alive? I don't know. But that's a fascinating history of madness. Okay. So, next part of the argument, though, back to the Phaedo, is the soul is eternal. So that's a good quiz question, you think? I have to be careful because the second question I have on my test is concerned with the soul. But do you have a soul? And if you do, what do you think it is? What do you think your soul is? Obviously, that's something that's changed over the course of history as well. A lot of people today don't think we have souls. They think we're just bodies. I have a particular fondness for Stuart Hammerhoff.
welcome to episode 3 of Unstoppable, the podcast. I am your host, Mr. Kerwin Ray, and in this episode, we're getting down and digging with the quantum stuff. We are interviewing Dr. Stuart Hameroff. He's an anesthesiologist, so he's a dude that typically knocks people unconscious, but that has led him to a pursuit to learn more about consciousness, and as a quantum physicist and a professor at the University of Arizona, he has gone deep.
That's just a, here it is.
Hello, I'm Patrick Stewart. Did you know that right now over 7...
evidence that they do that in terms of different anesthetics having different potency effects. For example, if we take, there's 3 vapor